Muchos países alrededor del mundo
Many
se han
countries around the
comprometido a
world
avanzar hacia la
have
cobertura
committed to advance
universal de
towards
salud, la CUS, que
universal health coverage
implica prestar todos los servicios de
that
salud que la gente requiere
implies
con
that
calidad
we
y
must
sin
provide
causar
all the
penurias
services that
financieras.
people require without
Pero
causing
estamos aún lejos de
any
alcanzar esa meta.
financial
Millones de personas
harm
tienen grandes
or burden.
dificultades para
Many
acceder a
people
los
have many
servicios de salud
difficulties to
prometidos por
access
sus
health
gobiernos o
services
enfrentan
promised by
serios
the
problemas
government, or they
financieros para
face
obtener los
serious
servicios y las
financial problems
medicinas
to
que
obtain the
necesitan.
services and the medications
Estas
that they need.
situaciones ocurren no solo por
These
falta de recursos
situations not
para la
only
salud,
occur because of a
sino por
lack of
grandes
resources for
ineficiencias
health,
en
but
el
also
gasto del
because of
sector.
great
Y se
inefficiencies
estima que cerca del
in
40% de los
sectors
recursos
spending,
se
and over
desperdician por
40% of the
esta razón.
resources are
¿Qué
wasted
imaginas
because of
que
this
podría
reason.
lograrse si se
Could you
disminuyen esas
imagine what would be
ineficiencias?
achieved if we reduce these
El curso
inefficiencies?
masivo abierto en
The
línea ¿Qué
open,
financiar en
massive
salud y a
online
qué
course
precio
that
aborda este
finance
desafío? Los fondos de
Financing
los
health and at
mejores
what price
especialistas del
faces
mundo en
this challenge
financiación
with
explícita
the
en
greatest
salud,
experts in
planes
the
de
world
beneficios y
for
herramientas de
benefit
regulación de
plans,
precios de
regulation,
medicamentos.
price
¿Quién,
regulation
desde
plans for
múltiples
medications,
perspectivas
who
y
from multiple
experiencias, te ayudarán
perspectives
a tomar
and
decisiones informadas
experiences
de
will help you
cobertura de
make
salud y
informed
de
decisions
regulación
on
de
health
precios de
coverage
medicamentos,
and medication
contribuyendo
price
para ayudar a
regulation,
los países a
contributing to
avanzar
help the
hacia la
countries
CUS
to
y lograr más salud
advance
para la
towards universal
población.
health coverage and to
Te
assist the
invitamos a
population in a
registrarte
better
para
way. We invite you to
participar en este
register to
MOOC.
participate.
A todos, muy buenas tardes, a todos y todas. Me da mucho
Good
gusto darles
afternoon,
la
everyone.
bienvenida a este webinar. Mi
It's a
nombre es
pleasure to
Pamela
greet
Góngora,
you
soy
to
asociada
this
senior en
webinar. I'm
IDB.
Pamela Góngora. I'm
Nuestro
Senior
English speaking
Health
audience
Specialist in
will have
IDB.
enabled simultaneous interpretation, which you can access by clicking the globe icon at the bottom of the screens. El video que acaban de ver es sobre nuestro curso gratuito. Uno de ellos
The
de uno de
video
los
that you just saw
invitados
is one of
expertos es
several on our free course that is linked to the
financiación y
topic that we are going to
esto
discuss
trata sobre
today, what we can finance in health and at what price. And it focuses explicitly on health and strategies to provide greater access to medications with top tier specialists that have invited. Today, we're going to share with you the results of a study on a very important topic for the health systems in a region, purchase of medications, their impact not only in health, but in different macroeconomic variables that are key to the countries. The study, as well as this webinar, are the result of a joint effort between three institutions that participated in the development of this study: IDB, Bank of the Republic of Colombia, and the University of Afit. The study will be officially available in November, and we'll send you the links directly to your emails once it's published. In this session, we will have the following dynamic. We're going to start with an interview with the main stakeholders of the study. We're going to have Oscar Avila Montalegre by our colleague, lead economist in Colombia and IAB. Then we're going to hear some comments by Claudia Vaca, expert on public policy and medications. And at the end, depending on the time, hopefully we'll have enough time. We'll have a brief session for questions and answers with all of you. Before starting, I'm going to briefly introduce you to our panelists today. I'm going to start with Jose Luis Ortiz Hoyos. He is a sociologist of the National University of Colombia. He has a master's degree in economics from the University of the Andes and a master's degree in public policies of the National University of Australia. He specialized in the design and implementation of policies and projects in areas of health and social protection. He worked during 8 years in the Ministry of Health of Colombia and international cooperation and migration and health. He's currently a senior specialist in health and social protection in the IDB in Colombia. Jesus Botero Garcia, economist and academic professor of the University of Afit, with a solid formation in economics in the University of Medellin, and specialized uh, in economic policies. He's been recognized for several research awards. Oscar Avila Montealegre, he's economist at the University of Rosario, also has a master's degree in economics from the same university and a PhD in economics from the University of Rochester in the United States. His areas of interest include international economics, trade, economic cycles, and emerging economies. He has experience in the Department of National Planning of Colombia, in the University of Rosario, the University of Rochester, and currently works in the Bank of the Republic. Finally, Claudia Vaca, pharmaceutical with a master's in epidemiology and
Innovación y Poder en la Universidad
clinical
Nacional de Colombia.
effectiveness, founder and director of
Ella es
the
licenciada técnica de alta
Center
calidad y
for
mucho
Medicines, Information, and
científico,
Power.
con un enfoque en el
She's
acceso
developed health
de
policies with
medicamentos y
focus on
medicamentos.
access to medications
Antes de comenzar con esta
and
demostración,
other
que espero que sea de interés de todos ustedes,
biotherapeutics.
me gustaría
Before
invitarlos a
beginning
que envíen
this,
las preguntas a
we would
través de
like
la
to invite you to
presentación
send
en
your
los
questions
costados
throughout the
para el link
presentation to
disponible
our
en
guests through the
pantalla
icon
abajo
that you're going to see
en la
on your
dirección de
screens,
preguntas y respuestas y en la
and
parte
where
inferior.
you will have
A todos, muchas gracias
questions,
por acompañarnos el día de hoy.
receive
Ahora
questions
le
and
cedo la
answers. So
palabra
thank
a
you very
Laura.
much for being here today, and I now give
Muchísimas
the floor
gracias,
to my
Pamela.
colleague,
Bienvenidos a
Laura.
todos.
Thank you
Estamos
very much,
muy
Pamela.
contentos
We
de
welcome
estar
you
hoy
all.
con
We're
nosotros.
thrilled to have
Tenemos
you
un
here today
panel
with
de
us. We
lujo, un
have
tema
a
interesantísimo. El tema
panel,
de
a
la
luxurious
cooperación de
panel
medicamentos es clave, no solo
with
para
an
la política
extremely
pública de
interesting
nuestros
topic, which
países,
is
sino
key
también
not
para
only
la
for public
sostenibilidad
policies in our
fiscal.
countries, but also for
Y
fiscal
tenemos que tener en
sustainability.
cuenta y
And we have to
conocer
bear
mejor
in
los
mind
efectos
and
macroeconómicos
have
de
better
este
knowledge
tipo
of
de
the
políticas
macroeconomic effects
públicas
that
a
this
nivel
type
del
of
sistema
policy can have at a
y para
level of
los
the whole
estados.
system
Hoy
and of
tenemos
our
un equipo de
economies.
lujo conformado
Today, we
por
have a
el Banco
team
de la
made up
República,
by
la
the
Universidad
Bank
del
of the
FIT,
Republic,
y vamos a
University of
explorar algunos de
Faith,
estos
and the
temas.
IDB.
Y quiero dar
IDB,
la
we're going to
bienvenida
explore
primero a
some
mi
of these
colega
topics, and I
José
want
Luis
to
Ortiz.
welcome our
Y quería
colleague Jose
comenzar
Luis
con
Ortiz. And I
una primera
wanted to
pregunta, José.
ask you a
Quería
first
saber
question, Jose.
cuál es la motivación general de
I
este
want to know
estudio,
what
qué
the general
llevó
motivation of this
con
study is
este partnership con estas
and what led to
organizaciones
this
y
partnership with these
empezar a analizar este tema.
organizations and to start to analyze this.
Gracias, Laura, y gracias
Thank
a
you very
todos y
much,
todas
Laura,
por
and
estar
thank
conectados
you all
en este espacio.
for joining us in
Primero,
this
me
space.
gustaría dar un
First,
corto contexto
I'd like to
sobre
just give you a brief
medicamentos en
context
Colombia.
on
Colombia,
health
para su nivel de ingresos,
spending
ha
in
logrado
Colombia.
mantener una parte
For its
importante
level
en
of
gasto
income, it
sanitario.
has invested an
Supera el
important
promedio de la región
amount
si lo
in
vemos en el
health.
gasto per
It
cápita.
exceeds the
Y si
level
lo
in the
vemos en
region
gasto
if we look
público
at
en
it
salud, también
as per
supera la media
capita
del grupo de países de ingresos
expenditure, and also
medio altos.
it
Dentro de esa inversión,
surpasses
el gasto en
several countries
medicamentos
in the region with
tiene una
medium to
participación
high
muy alta.
income. And
Tenemos
we
un
have
cupo
an
de
important share in
51%
even
de la OCDE.
above the average of the
Además,
countries
distintas estimaciones
of
muestran que el gasto
OECD.
en salud continuará
And we see
aumentando,
that
y
health
esto debido a
expenditure
un
will
conjunto de
continue to
factores,
increase, and this due to
la presión
several
demográfica,
factors
la presión
among
tecnológica
demographic
y el
pressure,
crecimiento de la
technological
economía.
pressure, and growth in social demands.
Siguiente diapositiva, por favor.
Next slide, please.
En este contexto,
In this
el Banco de la
context,
República
the
y el
Bank
FIT
of the Republic,
trabajan en
AFB, and
conjunto en
IDB
este
work
conocimiento.
together in the
Tiene
study
tres
that you will see
motivaciones
today, and that has three motivations
fundamentales.
that are interconnected.
Primero, en un contexto de
First,
gasto creciente en salud,
in a
¿cuáles
context
son los
of
efectos en el
growing
sector y a
spending
nivel
in health, what are the
macroeconómico
effects
de
in the
implementar
sector and at
medidas
a
más eficientes
macroeconomic
para comprar
level of
medicamentos?
implementing more
Segundo,
efficient
para responder al
measures
punto
in the
anterior,
purchase of
las
medications?
herramientas
Second, to respond to the
metodológicas
previous
usuales
point,
son medicinales globales,
what
como el estudio
methodological
longitudinal,
tools, usual
pueden
tools
articularse con
in
análisis
global
sectorial.
analysis can be
Y
articulated with
tercero, una
sectoral
motivación que
analysis?
se
And
siente
third,
más de política
a
pública,
motivation that is
busca
more of
conectar el
public policy that seeks
matiz
to
tercer sectorial,
connect a discussion
como
that
la
tends
búsqueda de
to be
eficiencia en el
sectoral,
consumo
such
de
as the seek for
medicamentos,
efficiency
con una situación
in
más
the purchase of
amplia
medications
de la eficiencia del gasto público
with a
y
broader
el gasto privado.
discussion on the economic effects in public spending, how
Muchísimas
to improve the
gracias,
efficiency
José.
of public spending. Thank you
Esa
very
es la
much,
motivación.
Jose.
Y yo te
Motivation is
pongo la
very
siguiente
complete. And
pregunta.
this takes me to my next
¿Cómo
question.
es, cómo funciona?
How,
Sé que es muy complejo y
well, I know that it's
tenemos
very
pocas horas,
complex
pero
and we would
¿cómo
need several
funciona el sistema
hours,
de
but
salud en
how
Colombia?
does the health
¿Qué
system work in
incluye los
Colombia and where do
medicamentos? ¿Cómo está
medications come
toda esta
into play?
dinámica y esta relación
Where
de
does this
poder
whole
en el sistema de
dynamic and
salud y cómo funciona hoy?
how does this work today? How does it
Gracias, Laura,
operate?
por esa pregunta.
Thank you,
En
Letta,
efecto,
for
explicar
this
el sistema
question.
nos
In
costaría
fact,
todo el
yeah, to
tiempo de la
explain the
sesión.
system would take
Voy a
us the whole
pasar
session, so I'm going to
rápidamente por
go
los elementos centrales
over
y
some
luego les voy a hablar un
main
poco más de
elements
eficiencia,
very
porque estamos uniendo
quickly, and
estos
I'm
dos
also going to
mundos.
talk about efficiency because we're
El
bringing
sistema
these two
colombiano
worlds
hoy
together.
está basado en la
The
aseguración,
Colombian system is
con una
today based
cobertura del
on
99% de la población.
insurance with a
La
coverage
financiación
of
del sistema
90% of the
proviene
population.
principalmente
And
de
this comes
recursos
mainly
públicos, ya
from
sean
public
contribuciones para
resources,
fiscales,
either
impuestos generales
contributions,
o
fiscal
impuestos
contributions,
sectoriales.
general
Para el año 2023,
taxes. For
el gasto del sistema se fue
2023,
a 82 billones de pesos, que en
expenditure in the
dólares son como
system
20.500 millones de
reached
dólares
around
por año. Estos recursos
20,500
son
million a year.
utilizados para
These
financiar el
resources are
conocimiento en
used
salud
to finance technologies in
en un
health
plan de
that are included
beneficios.
in
Dentro de
a
estas tecnologías
benefits
están los
plan. And
medicamentos
in those
y este plan
technologies, we have medicines.
es establecido por el gobierno.
And this plan is
Para la
established by the
definición de
government.
estos
For the definition of these resources, we have this, well, the government established an amount per person affiliated to the system, which is known as UPC. And on average this year, we're talking about $360 per person. Although it changes depending on the age, sex, location of residence, etc. So these 80 million pesos, they are put in a fund that is today managed by a public entity. It is called ADRES, and it drafts the amounts to the UPCs, to these health promoting units, depending on the number or according to the number of affiliates that they have. And these are in charge, among other things, of the purchase. And with these resources, EPSs, they make agreements with suppliers to have access to health services that include, obviously, medications. Finally, and this is a characteristic of the Colombian system. In Colombia, we also finance technologies that are out of this plan. So, in other words, this is due to multiple factors, and we've used different ways to try to acknowledge these expenditures that are not included here, but that are important to take into account because they are part of the benefits plan as well as others. Next, please. As I said, it is also important to talk about efficiency for 2 seconds. Aside from the context of the system, it is important to refer to what it is that we're understanding as efficiency within the context of this study. As is shown in the IDB publication, there are 3 elements to achieve an adequate purchase with the best agreement and spending as little as possible. And when we talk about agreements, we refer to these elements to have better agreements. Thank you, Jose. When we talk about efficiency, how do we calculate this to determine how much we can save on medications? Okay, so here I'm going to go into the details of this study. For this study, our main focus are the medications that are financed with public resources that we saw before. The design of the health system in Colombia is an important part. So particularly, we analyze transactions that correspond to the payment for medications with resources from the health system by different operators, among those EPSs. This information is obtained from an information system in Colombia that is called SISMET, the information system for medications. And after doing this work and with information from the Ministry of Health and INVIMA, we classify the medications considering 2 criteria. Ones are included in the benefits plan, and 2, if they are medications that are subject to some type of regulation for price control. Once we organize the information, we establish 3 scenarios for an efficient purchase. And this is understood as the purchase that is done at a minimum unit price recorded in a month, because that's the most favorable price when we purchase multiple medications. And in an initial scenario, we assume that all the purchases are efficient. So in other words, all the purchases are made at a minimum price. In a second scenario, we assume that the prices that are regulated are done efficiently. And the third, for non-regulated purchases, these are done in an inefficient way. Next slide, please. So what did we find? In 2023, the overall spending in health reported or registered by IDES is 24.3. And of this, well, 24.3% was dedicated to medications. And here we see that there's an amount that corresponds to medications through benefits. This represents approximately 88% of the whole expenditure. And then there are medications that are out of the benefits plan. And this is calculated as the difference between the overall amount invoiced in 2023 and what would have been invoiced if the purchases had been done efficiently in each one of these scenarios. What you see there are the main results. In the first scenario, where we include all the medications, we reach potential savings of up to 74%. In the second scenario, with regulated medications, well, we have 23% savings. And finally, in the scenario that has non-regulated medication savings reach 11.5%.
Teniendo en cuenta esos resultados, para
Considering these
analizar los
results,
efectos macrofiscales de
to
cada
analyze the
unidad, se
macrofiscal
utilizan dos modelos de equilibrio general
aspects of
que vamos
this,
a
we
analizar.
use two
El
general
modelo de
balance
equilibrio general computable, que nos permite evaluar los
models
efectos sobre el gasto
that allow
público
us to evaluate the effects on public
y el
spending
déficit
and
fiscal,
health and the
y
fiscal
el modelo de
deficit,
equilibrio general dinámico,
and the
que nos
general
permite analizar el
dynamic
efecto de alternativas de financiamiento
equilibrium model.
e impactos en valores como
And this
la
helps us analyze the
producción, el
effect of
consumo
alternatives for
o la inversión.
financing and the impacts in
Con esto,
production,
Laura,
consumption,
resumimos
and investment.
tanto los
So with this,
resultados
Laura, we
de esta parte
summarize
como
the
la
results of this
metodología.
part as well as the methodology.
Muchísimas gracias, José. Y voy a darle la
Thank you very
palabra a
much,
nuestros
Jose. And now I'm going to
colegas
give the
del
floor to
Banco
our
de la
colleagues
República
from
y de AFIP,
the
a Oscar y
Bank
a
of the
Jesús,
Republic, Banco de la
que quieren
República,
contarnos un
and
poquito cómo
AFIT,
plantean estos
Oscar, and
modelos
Jesus. And I'd
de
like to
balance.
know how you consider
Los que
these
somos economistas los
models of
usamos
general
mucho,
balance.
por
Those of us that
ejemplo,
are
para
economists
análisis
use
de
these
la
very much for
economía.
general
Se nos ha dado algunos
analysis of the
sectores,
economy. They've been
empezamos a
used for
hablar
some
cada vez
sectors,
más
and now they're
pragmáticos,
being
también
used more for
sectoriales,
some
como
very
tenemos
sectoral
acá.
questions as the ones that we have
Paso la
here.
palabra para que nos cuenten un
I
poquito
give you
de
the
sus
floor so that you can
perspectivas.
comment a bit on how this
Bueno,
is
muy
done.
bien.
Okay, well,
Primero es un gusto estar aquí
Raul,
con
first, it's a pleasure
ustedes
to be
y
here
un
with you,
honor haber participado en este
and
estudio
it's an honor to
en
have
un tema
participated in
que
this
es sin
study
lugar a dudas
on something that
urgente
is
del país, más
undoubtedly
ahorita en
crucial for
momentos
the
de crisis
country,
de verdad,
especially
hay
when
una profunda
we're
reforma del sistema.
talking about a reform in
Lo
the
fundamental,
system.
pues nosotros
And
usamos un modelo
in
de equilibrio
what
general
is fundamental, we
computable
use
bien rico
a
en detalles.
computable
Lo describo
equilibrium
brevemente a
model that
partir
is very
del
rich
diagrama que ven
in
ustedes ahí.
data, and I'll explain
Digamos
it
que
based on the
los hogares,
diagram that you
en
see here.
principio, tienen
And the
dos
households, in
grandes
principle, they
decisiones que
have
tomar.
two
Unas decisiones de oferta y
main
trabajo,
decisions to make.
que
One
son
is
las
on the
decisiones
work
que
offer,
están
which are the decisions
representadas ahí
that are
en las
represented
dos
there
casillas, una que dice
in
ofrecen
these
trabajo
two
no
boxes, one that
calificado y
says
otra trabajo
that
calificado, y
non-qualified
toman también decisiones de
work is
consumo.
offered and the other
El
one
trabajo
qualified
no
work.
calificado es muy
Non-qualified
importante entenderlo bien
work,
porque
it is very
solo
important to
parte de ese
understand it
trabajo
adequately because only
va al
part of that
sector
work
formal y solo la
goes to the
implicación
formal
de esa
sector,
parte que va al sector
and
formal
consequently that
contribuye
part that will be formal
con pagos al
contributes
sistema. La parte que no va
with payments to the system.
al sector
The part
formal
that does not go to the
genera
formal
pues una
part
producción informal,
generates
aquí la
an
tenemos en,
informal production. We have it here
naranja, y a
in
partir
the
de ella se genera
orange
un valor
box,
agregado
and from
formal.
there,
Ese
there's
trabajo no
an amount that
calificado
is generated.
formal se une al
Form
capital
a
y al trabajo
non-qualified
calificado
labor
para producir
is part
valor
of
agregado
qualified
formal.
work
Así
to
que la
produce
economía, por un
formal
lado, está
value
produciendo
added.
valor
So the
agregado
economy on one hand
informal,
is
por otro lado está
creating
generando
informal
valor
value
agregado
added, on
formal.
the other,
Ambas
formal.
producciones
And both
demandan
productions
insumos intermedios
demand
y en los insumos intermedios,
intermediate
entonces, pues
resources.
básicamente
And so basically,
generan una producción total
they
para el país.
generate
El modelo es
an
cuidadoso
overall
ver cómo
production
se
for
toman
the
decisiones
country.
sobre esto.
But it's important
Modela con mucho
to
cuidado la
see how we
decisión
can make
consumidora
decisions based on
acerca de
this,
si demanda un bien informal
on
o
whether
demanda un
if
bien
an
formal,
informal
intentando captar muy
good
bien cómo
is
todas las
required or an
decisiones de
informal
política pública
one,
que vayan a afectar de
considering
alguna
all
manera la
these
economía,
public
pues tienen consecuencias
regulations that
también sobre el
are
consumidor y
considered.
por
This also
supuesto
will
sobre
also
las
have
rentas que van a estar
consequences
recibiendo los
on the
trabajadores
consumer
pues por impuestos.
and
La
on
producción total del
the
modelo se
net
discrimina entre
revenues that the
exportaciones
government will receive.
y
And this
ventas
is separated
domésticas.
among
Se modela con mucho
domestic
cuidado, como
sales
dije,
and
y
exports,
desestiman
and
las
this has to be
exportaciones
managed very
y las
carefully.
ventas domésticas
And domestic
se ahogan
sales,
a las importaciones, que también
they
se
are
manejan
also
con
part of
cuidado, con
imports that are
criterios
also
de regulación
modeled
de la actividad constante. Y en estas entonces,
carefully.
pues
And
tenemos
so with this, we
básicamente la
basically
oferta
have the
total del
overall
modelo, pues
supply that the model,
iguala a la demanda. Y la demanda, por
well,
supuesto, está
in
conformada
which the
por
model puts this at the same level
demanda
of
de insumos
the demand
intermedios
of
como inversión por parte
intermediate
pública y privada.
resources or
El modelo es rico
materials.
en cuanto a
The model
detalles
is rich in terms
de
of the
ramas
details
porque pues básicamente
of branches
considera
because
las
basically
12
it
ramas
considers the
convencionales de los
12
dígitos
conventional
de la clasificación de
branches
sectores de
in the
las cuentas
classification
nacionales
of
y
sectors
le
of
pone
national
pues
accounts
específico foco al
and
sector de
places
salud.
specific focus on
Tiene
health.
en consecuencia de
It
esas
has
12 ramas
consequently from those
17
13
tipos de
branches
productos
and
para
17
discriminar
types of
algunos
products
productos
to
que tienen una
discriminate some
importancia
products
especial en Colombia,
that
como
have
oil, por
special
ejemplo,
importance in
que
Colombia,
tiene
such
por
as oil,
supuesto una
that of course
importancia
has
fundamental.
is of great
Y
importance
tiene 20 tipos
and
de hogares.
has 20
Es
types
decir, el
of
modelo
households. So in other
clasifica
words,
toda la
the
población
model
colombiana
classifies the whole
por
Colombian
deciles y en
population
cada decil
by
identifica
deciles, and
un
in
hogar
each decile,
representativo
it
rural y otro
identifies a representative
representativo
rural
urbano.
household and
Importante porque
also a
muchas de las
representative
limitaciones de
urban
acceso al
household
sistema
because
están asociadas
due
a
to,
hogares
because many of the
rurales y en
limitations of the
consecuencia es muy
system
importante tener
are
recursos
because of
económicos para poder
to have
pagar esa
access to
adición.
rural households, and we need to have more details on this. The model has 4 government instances. It has the central government, it has ADRES, which is in charge of the health system, it has pensions, and the rest of the public entities grouped in the fourth decimal. What do we do with this? So we try with all this richness of production in the economy, we try to simulate what is going to happen with the contributions and what is going to happen with expenditure. The contributions in the system are associated to collection that we have and contributions in these productive branches. So we calculate the contribution that each branch has in the formal work that is being hired or contracted. And the expenditure, well, we calculate this with the criteria of what the or who the individuals that are associated to this contributions regime or the subsidized one. So we model how UPC of the contributions regime operates, and then we look for the way in which we can update all the pressures that a system such as ours is experiencing. And the most important one is this change in the population pyramid that is leading to greater participation with additional costs in health. Also, the changes in the demand for services, more procedures, more technologies, but also because I think Colombians, they trust the system and demand services, and we de-aggregate the medications in our analysis to try to simulate or model those trajectories with the model for medication pricing. So in summary, we model the contributions with a very well structured model for the market. We model health expenditure, trying to simulate the best way possible how this evolves, how the demand evolves, how the costs evolve, and that way we calculate, which is the purpose of the exercise. We calculate what the transfers are that central government requires to cover the deficit that is generated. So that is the exercise that we work on.
Muchísimas gracias. Oscar, por favor,
Thank you very
adelante.
much. Oscar, please.
Muchas gracias.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think that we can go on to the next slide. Perfect. As to dynamic general equilibrium model, what we try to do is understand the macroeconomic effects of different financing schemes. So what we're doing in that exercise is that we have savings that is going to generate a reduction in public spending in health to a certain degree. And what that is going to generate is that the government can somehow reduce some type of tax. So that is the purpose of using the model, to look at the macro effect. If I make that adjustment with the tax on consumption or capital tax. So the structure of the model is relatively simple. We're going to have two large households in this model. We're going to have one, which is a qualified one, that is going to have access to financial markets. It's going to be the owner of the capital. It's going to offer high productivity, labor. And on the other hand, we're going to have non-qualified or unqualified households that are at the bottom. They're more restricted in terms of access to financial markets. They will not be able to acquire debt, but the only adjustment margin that they're going to have is to work with the formal or informal sectors. And clearly, both sectors are going to have differences in terms of productivity. The formal sector is going to be more productive than the informal one. In the next phase, we're going to have companies that are going to use capital, qualified labor, formal and informal, unqualified work, and both formal and informal are going to pay taxes. So that's where the government is going to come into play to see how it's going to finance that health spending. If it's going to charge qualified labor or unqualified labor, and there we're going to have most of the dynamic and the richness of our model. Now we're going to look at a next phase where we're going to have a company that produces goods, and here what we're going to produce are the goods or merchandise that will be used for consumption in qualified and unqualified households, and we're going to allocate investments and net exports. And here we're going to have a last tax, which is a consumption tax, which is no longer on consumption factors, but more on the side of the demand. So what the government is going to do is collect all those taxes, and it's going to distribute them as a way of health spending for qualified and unqualified households. And with this structure, what we do is adjust the model for the Colombian reality. So we're going to take different amounts from the Colombian community, and we're going to try for the model to at least replicate that snapshot of the Colombian society of recent years. And once we have that, we're going to start with the exercises for the efficient purchase of medications. That's the model, the general dynamic model, and I think that we can now move on to the next slide. Thank you. Thank you very much, Oscar and Jesus. And well, what we're all waiting is what are the results? How do these results look with your model, with the expenditure dynamic, considering that we have all these savings in the sector? How do you see this? Well, very well. In general, the first thing is that, as we all know, the sector is undergoing enormous pressure. And as we see in this graph, health expenditure as a percentage of the GDP, it's at almost 7.4% with enormous pressures. And why? Well, we know basically because on one hand, there's a very clear demographic pressure that is associated to the aging of the population. And second, because there's a demand for new services, new technologies, there's a significant and important increase in pressures for new technologies, new services, and we're committed to these objectives. And in the end, it's a public policy. First, to improve access, which is a problem that maybe causes more problems in the system. And if we achieve all this as Colombians, we're going to see great pressure. And the dotted lines and the black line at the bottom show the benefits that an intelligent intervention would have on the efficiency of expenditures in medications. And we suppose that we will be able to implement all these efficiency improvements that were mentioned a moment ago. And fundamentally, they respond to a universe in which we have to make an efficient purchase of medications, and this will attenuate the pressures in the time horizon to 2040. Instead of having an expenditure of 7.4% of the GDP, we would have one of 6.6%. So in other words, there's enormous relief for individuals. And if we look at it in terms of demand for the government, well, basically in the base year, the difference that exists between the expenditure in health services or benefits as in comparison to the contributions by formal workers in Colombia, this has to be covered by central government, and it's 2.7 at origin, and as the pressures increased, we reached 5.4. And you can see that then naturally the efficient purchases can very importantly moderate the impact that these pressures have and would bring us back to 4.6%. This has different types of benefits. The first one is that the model, which is a model guided by savings, and well, it releases some resources that can be invested and that will lead to an additional small growth, which is important, of course, as a macroeconomic result. But if we put this in practical terms of increase of spending pressure, what we see here is clear. The reference scenario versus today versus the calibration of the model will generate the country the need of 2.6% of the GDP, which is higher in terms of resources to give us the health that we want and that we desire as Colombians.
So, if we manage to make regulated medicine purchase efficient, it becomes 2.4. If we get the regulated ones to be purchased effectively, we would be talking about 3.1. But if we join the two efficiencies, if we buy efficiently both regulated and unregulated, the pressure goes down to 1.8%, which would mean deficit would improve by 0.8, which would be the trajectory for the first year of the launch. And then towards the end, we have three possible scenarios. If we efficiently purchase all regulated ones, non-regulated, or both of them. And let's move on to the next one. This, in percentage terms, would look like this. We kick off with projected deficit of 2.91 and reach 5.4% by 2040 in the reference scenario. So we are talking about an additional pressure of 2.51. But let's look at it this way. If we efficiently purchase non-regulated medicines, we'll be looking at 5.16% and 2.25% increase in burden. And it'll be 4.95 if we talk about regulated, and 1.71 if we talk about all medicines. And in percentage terms, this is a figure that I love to quote. Look, we have gigantic pressure as a society to provide the healthcare we deserve and want to have. If we're able to purchase efficiently, 31.9% of the burden of the pressure would be manageable by means of efficient purchasing. And one key point would be this. You have three possible paths to deal with adjustment issues or misadjustment issues. If we have 5.42, you have a significant mismatch between the contributions and the benefits you want to offer. So there are three ways to change this. One is to increase contributions. If we were able to formalize more, if we're able to bring more workers into the formal sector. The second path is restricting services, but Colombians are not prepared to accept that. The third path is efficiency. And consider what efficiency means in this field. It's 1/3 of the effect we could assume. So that would be the main conclusion of the study. And well, with that, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jesus. And a saving of 0.8% of GDP, substantial, by effectively and efficiently purchasing medicines. And this is just medicines. We can have so many other efficiencies in the health care system. It's not that savings should be an incentive per se, but reducing the tax burden would be very useful because we would have income that could go into reinvestments in the system. And then I would like to give the floor to Oscar. And in the meantime, I will invite all participants to feel free to share any questions or comments. Let's look at Oscar's results. And this is something interesting, right, Oscar? Because not only can we reinvest through fiscal policy and save, but also we could consider what we do with the revenue, right? What's your view on this? Thanks very much for the introduction. This is a very interesting question because a policy can have different fiscal effects. And what we are trying to do as part of this model is consider that we'll have a saving if we efficiently purchase all documents, and the saving would be 0.84%. And that's a saving that in fiscal terms we could use to pay off debt or to lower taxes. And what we try to do as part of this exercise is to look at the macro effect of reducing some tax. So we get different instruments as part of our model. That's what you can see on the right-hand side graph. And we're going to look at three taxes. What if the savings we generate come from reducing the taxes on consumption? That would bring about a percentage reduction of almost 0.5 in terms of the tax on consumption. We would go down from a rate that was 11 and bring it down to 5. So, of course, it may look little in Colombia. Consumption is really about 80% of GDP. So all of that saving can be achieved just by bringing down the tax on consumption a little bit. Couple other options are to bring down the tax on capital, the capital tax, or we could also reduce taxes on the hiring of skilled labor, skilled work. And the fact is that most workers are unskilled. So you would require a much more significant reduction. There will be proportional effects depending on the policy you implement. If you just decide to efficiently purchase regulated medicines, the saving is lower, the tax reductions will be lower too. If you do it for the regulated ones, it'll be even less, and the savings by way of taxes will also be low. But it's interesting not just to see what will happen in terms of taxes, but also to see which of these reductions will create a better macro impact. Let's look at the macroeconomic impact as part of the next slide, and this broken down by each alternative. And here we choose the most interesting variables in macro terms. One will be GDP, the other one will be investment, and the last one consumption. So this will be very interesting because what you get to see is the light blue bar that shows what happens when you decide to reduce taxes on capital. You save the money, reduce that, and this will yield the highest gains in terms of production. Capital is an essential factor in the productive process. And when you reduce the tax on capital, businesses invest a lot more. So we can see an increase in that investment bar, very significant. And we can see more production at the end of the day. And also important is the fact that we also have gains in terms of the general equilibrium of the model. When businesses decide to invest more, they demand more capital. And in order to produce more, they increase the demand for labor, both skilled as well as unskilled. So at least this scenario tells us this. First of all, in all three cases and scenarios, we'll have gains in terms of production, investment, and consumption. But possibly the best strategy would be to try and use these savings for a tax that would have a better macro effect. That would be the tax on capital. And with that, at least I share with you the key conclusion, at least as far as this part is concerned. Thank you very much, Oscar. The interesting thing about this is that we're not just looking at strategies for reinvestment of savings, also reducing the tax burden, but also trying to see how there could be an income side fiscal policy. When you look at it from a systemic perspective, looking at the whole economy, possibilities emerge. And with that, I would like to hand it over to José Luis for his conclusion and wrap up, and then we'll have Claudia Vaca, and then our Q&A. We already have quite a few questions. Thanks very much to all of you. And those of you who haven't yet had the courage to share questions, please do so through the Q&A. Thanks, Laura. Before sharing the conclusions, let me note something as far as the methodology is concerned, which I think is important. I said that we use the National Information System, the SISMED, which might seem easy, but is not. There was quite a challenge in terms of information and of getting it organized. And here you have some conclusions that are more related to the content. I would like to thank Jesus Rodriguez and Christian from the bank who did a terrific job. On the conclusions, I would highlight 5 of them for now. First, efficient medicine purchase could have positive macro fiscal effects in the long term. So that's an area to further explore. In the short term, there is a saving potential of up to 34.5% of public spending as far as medicines are concerned. And efficient medicine purchase could contribute to financing the additional deficit. So it would bring it down by between 10.4 and 31.9%. In the long term, there's a saving potential of up to 10.8% in public health spending. And finally, potential saving would enable a reduction of the tax burden on capital, consumption, or social contributions, which would drive production by up to 1.10%, investment by 1.73%, and consumption by 0.77%, which I think are very significant results. So, Laura, I think this could be perhaps also a trigger for the questions. Those are the main conclusions. So, thank you, Jose Luis. As you will see, the impact is not minor, whether it be in terms of spending or other key macroeconomic variables. I just want to thank all study participants, Jose Luis, Oscar, Jesus, Christian, Jesus, Alicia, who are not presenting today, but who are a key part of this whole effort. With that, I would like to give the floor to Claudia Vaca for some final comments. Claudia, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for doing this work and giving us an opportunity to highlight the importance it has. I think this research is very valuable with a view to decisions in Colombia that need to address the challenges raised by the study in terms of health, the technological and demographic and epidemiological pressure, and of course, there's the importance of solving or dealing with the inequalities between urban, peripheral, and rural areas. And these are all things relating to the healthcare system in Colombia. And the challenges related to inequities are what authors have called increasing social demands, right? Which are not minor in the context of the country's current discussions. The exercise done by the researchers highlighting the results in the context of controlled models, considering, of course, the particular conditions of the study, we think that the think tank on medicines and information is a great tool, and we take a critical view of the calculations, we review the methodologies, and the conclusions you suggest are very interesting, and we see this as feasible. So the results are not crazy. Quite on the contrary, they're highly encouraging. And as mentioned at the outset, they're a very strong sign for designers to, or decision makers to design even more efficient strategies. The results you are sharing very much tie in with the monitoring we've done in the case of pharmaceuticals for many years, and in particular, one research project that was recently completed on pharmaceutical regulations, obstacles, shortcuts, and this included the National University, the think tank, and the Association of Pharmaceutical Centers in Colombia. So we looked at the behavior of the pharmaceutical market between 2010 and 2023, and we realized that Colombia tripled the size of its pharmaceutical market, which went from 6.9 billion pesos to 24.7 billion pesos. And the key point that we're all trying to highlight here is that 67% of that market value, so about or over 17 billion pesos, comes from public funds. So it's paid for out of funds in the Colombian public health sector. We're talking about 20% of health spending. And I would like to clarify that if we look at Chile, Mexico, and so on, we are looking at a much larger size than in Colombia, but none of them has such significant public health spending components as Colombia does. So Colombia finances much of the market through public health funds. And many may say, okay, it's good for the figure to be a high one, and it's good to have a system leveraging health spending. But shouldn't we ask what the spending focuses on? What conditions, what population, and above all, what medicines we are talking about, so as to know what the money gets spent on, to see if every peso we invest is really translated into health results. The fact of the matter is that much of the pharmaceutical spending in Colombia very much reflects the situation in other parts of the world. There's cancer, cardiovascular diseases. This we have found in the studies we have done. Now, one interesting thing about this study is that these are the ideal conditions of efficient purchases, but we should also consider a design of variables which, as part of a smart model, will help improve the efficiency of spending with a focus on demand. In other words, to focus on medicines that can lead to greater health impacts and better transform the epidemiological profile and health conditions for population. Above all, seeking efficiencies where there are generics or lower priced medicines that are available in the local and Latin American markets, so as to achieve even higher levels of autonomy and less technological dependence in terms of what's going on around the world. Also thinking of the pandemics and these things that no country could escape, even high-income countries. Now, the Colombian medicine market very much focuses on new medications. We're talking about monopolistic, highly concentrated markets, very high-priced drugs. We are probably underusing the supply of generics and instead using higher priced medications when we might be looking at medicinal products that have the same components. And of course, the idea would also be to foster greater competition in this segment. The data you have shared today, part of the collaboration between the IDB and the entities in Brazil as well, could be useful. The Colombian health system has a great capacity for negotiation in the health sector and could probably also include the government improving access and really making the most of its bargaining capacity. And that's also important, and it emerges from the research we've done in this field in recent years, that bargaining capacity could also offer room for more efficiencies and also take into account the country's industrial development as part of the industrialization policy that Colombia is pursuing. There's a document that was approved or adopted at the end of last year and paves the way for more opportunities for economic growth, even beyond the actual health sector. So thank you very much for the invitation to share some comments on the study. And of course, these results are a great motivation to keep going. Thank you very much Claudia, it is indeed a pleasure for us to have you with us, and thank you for all that help over these months of hard work on these studies. So thank you very much for your time and for your participation. We'll now move on to the questions through the chat. Let me take the first question. I think there's, well, Jose, I will let you take care of this. Have you considered any technological transformation aspects in calculating the details shown in the study?
Digamos, por el lado de la identificación de los
As regards the
ahorros, digamos,
identification of savings, the technological pressure is a key factor that we mentioned at the beginning. And what we have found is that there is significant room for generating efficiencies. And we may also later focus on high-cost medicines, which may be outside the scope of the benefits plan. But there are several issues to consider, not just price regulation, of course, but I don't know whether Jesus, Claudia, or Oscar would like to add anything.
Tal vez yo solo tendría que decir que
all I would probably add is that the estimates made on SysMed data, on the basis of SysMed data,
si bien a veces pareciera que de ese
among other sources, would suggest that the bulk of the medications, 20%,
es cierto también que la
include or let's say take up 70% of the spending. It's also true that the acceleration of public spending focuses on the new medications with one major point. We very quickly bring those innovations into the benefits plan. So the spending component that shows the highest acceleration in growth is related to the new incoming medicines. I would need to look at models or estimates of analysis to see whether the intensity of use, in this case, the demand, is considering the higher efficiency in the use of such medicines. Are we just including them merely because they're new without actually considering the kind of patients that would probably need to use them so as to avoid any risks to the sustainability of the system? And by way of a procedural note, let me say this. Let's assume we manage to significantly control the efficiency side of things, and we, of course, consider the new technologies and medicines that might come along. There's obviously an initial adjustment. And let's move on to the next question, which is related to medicines. We would like to know whether price regulation has had an impact on the availability of medicines in the Colombian market. Well, that may also be something that has to do with the monitoring of the pharmaceutical market, the impact and negative externalities of regulation. We have carried out several studies between 2012, when we introduced the first price regulation in the country, and until now we haven't really found a link between regulation and the lack or unavailability of medicines that would have otherwise previously been available and started to be scarce or less widely available afterwards, with one particular exception that has more to do with the dependency on the raw materials around the world. Regulation hasn't discouraged the introduction of new products. In fact, with the IDB, some 8 years ago, we did a study
focusing on innovations to see when they entered
the different countries in Latin America. And Colombia is one of the first countries to embrace new medicines, especially related to the treatment of certain conditions like diabetes. And we could say that the one thing we might want to study and monitor is the extent to which uncertainty regarding fiscal space and changes in the way the system works could perhaps start to have an impact on the adoption of these new products. But anyway, this is just some of the questions that come up. Thank you. And we'll take one more question for Oscar and Jesus from Tarragona. The question is how you model the demand for medicines, considering the differences among consumers and places. The model assumptions, of course, are dealing with very complex models. We'll be publishing the study in a few months, and the Banco de la República has also done a great job on health and has some very detailed technical annexes that describe the model. But as far as demand is concerned, that we could address. Go ahead, please.
Bueno, entonces si quieres yo arranco. Por el lado de la demanda, aquí nosotros estamos
On the demand
pensando
side,
más
here
por el lado
we
de
are
cuál es la presión de
thinking
gasto
more in
público
terms of
en
what
salud, por
the
lo menos en el
public
modelo
spending
final, ¿no? No
burden
estamos,
is in
digamos
terms
que
of
en ese
health.
sentido la demanda termina siendo un poco exógena,
Demand
porque en este momento
somehow
no
ends
tenemos
up
enteramos
being
del perfil
somewhat
demográfico,
exogenous, as we don't take into
demandas que
account
pueden
the
venir
demographic profile or
por
the
ese
sort of
cambio
demand that may
en la
stem
población. Sin
from
embargo, es un
the
espacio bien
changes in
grande de
population.
mejora,
Of
por lo
course,
menos
there is
en el
much
modelo
room for
que ya
improvement
estamos considerando,
as reflected by the
digamos,
model,
para una futura versión.
and we are
Yo,
already
digamos, lo
considering
dejaría
this
por lo menos
for
ahí
a
para el
future
caso
version.
del
I
modelo
think
de equilibrio general dinámico, como para
that
no entrar en otras
is where I
particularidades,
would
pero sí
stop in
tenemos,
terms
digamos,
of the
algunos
dynamic
escenarios
general equilibrium
alternativos
model. I wouldn't
en
go into
donde para el caso
specificities,
de
but we do have some
medicamentos, donde
alternative
lo que se está
scenarios.
haciendo es una política de que se sustituye un
And,
medicamento que es más
you know,
costoso por uno
there's a
más
policy
barato, pues
to
eso al final no
substitute
debería casi que
more
afectar la utilidad de
costly
la gente,
drugs
porque él está
with
igual recibiendo
lower
casi que el
priced
mismo
ones.
bien.
And the
Entonces
fact is
nosotros
that
tenemos
people
escenarios en los
end up
cuales
receiving basically the
cuantificamos
same medicine.
ese
So
ejercicio
we have a
y vemos
scenario that
cómo él
includes a
pudo justificar sin
quantification,
modificar,
and we
digamos, la utilidad
also
percibida,
um,
termina generando efectos
see
macro.
that
Entonces, por
this
lo menos para este ejercicio en particular, creo que con
fact
con
I
esa
mentioned that
modificación del
the
modelo
perceived
logramos capturar
effectiveness is not modified
digamos,
also
dinámicas
allows us
de
to
salud. No sé,
reflect
Jesús,
the
No, básicamente,
dynamic
pues digámosle que para lo
process
que
that
es
this
propiamente
involves in the
hablando
health
la
sector.
evolución del
And
sistema,
Jesus,
aplicamos las
well,
metodologías
as
típicas
regards
que
the
los estudios
evolution
de
of the
eficiencia
system,
se aplican.
we apply
Ya
the
una vez
typical
que hemos escalado
methodologies
de nuevo, digamos, el
that are
gasto
used
en
in
medicamentos
studies
y
dealing
todo
with
el sistema en
efficiencies.
general
Once we
queda pues
have
en el nuevo nivel a partir de la compra eficiente,
scaled things
pues
up
ya de ahí en
and
adelante aplicamos
everything
criterios como
has
son de
reached
cómo aumentan los
the
precios
same
de
level,
frecuencia,
we
los precios
apply
de inflación, para que vayan
conventional
entonces obligando a que se
models,
recomponga la demanda y
trending and
obviamente vamos
others.
reflejando cómo la
And of
población se va
course,
envejeciendo y entonces la
we also
ponderación de uno de
consider
los grupos
the
sociales, de
aging
los grupos
of
etarios, perdón,
population
va haciendo que la demanda
and
aumente
the changes in
en
age
el sistema.
groups,
Es
of
decir,
course,
hacemos
have
pues
an
como el
impact
ejercicio de
on
la
demand
manera
on the
como se
system.
haría
So
el
the
sistema
exercise we do is
de,
very much
de fijación de la
like
UPC con los
the
estudios de eficiencia.
UPC would do with its efficiency studies. Thanks. And the last part of this question, public procurement is centralized as part of this model assumption, or are there many
A ver,
parties involved?
básicamente
Yes,
el modelo pues naturalmente tiene
of
algo que
course.
está
The
proveyendo de
model
recursos a las EPS y se les está
has
poniendo a disposición
these
implícitamente pues un mecanismo por el cual se
assumptions,
pueda
and
lograr
of course,
negociar
the
mejor.
idea is
Y
to
hay
have
una
a
lección
mechanism
pública
that
acerca de
will
cuáles son
enable
los
better
medicamentos que se
negotiation,
consideran
better
pues que
bargaining.
son
And
eficientes
of course,
y
we
costo
have
efectivos.
a list or roster, and we also know what medicines are not just effective, but also cost efficient.
Tal vez solo
Muchísimas
para
gracias.
agregar ahí, Laura, o sea,
If I may
Adelante, José.
also
sí,
add there,
tomando lo que dice
yes,
Jesús,
adding to what Jesus said,
se deja un poco abierto eso porque, digamos, en el
that's
diseño del
somewhat
sistema
open-ended because
compradores, que fue lo que explicó
the system design includes multiple purchases.
hay mecanismos que pueden generar eficiencias,
There
como
are
la
mechanisms that
algunos
may
medicamentos
create
que
efficiencies,
benefician eso, pero hay otras políticas, transparencia en la
but
información
there are
de
also other
precios,
policies,
todo eso podría o
price
debería generar esa
transparency in
eficiencia,
terms of
inclusive
information,
en un ambiente de varios compradores.
and even if you have multiple purchases, of course.
Muchísimas gracias y ya son las
Thanks
4
very
de la tarde,
much.
hora de DC, 3
It's already 3 p.m. in Colombia and 4 in DC. Time for us to wrap up our webinar. We'd like to thank all participants for joining us today. José Luis Ortiz, Oscar Ávila, Jesús Botero, and Claudia Vaca. We'd also like to thank all of the social protection and health team, the Criteria Network, Pamela, and our other colleagues helping us with these very successful webinars. This webinar will be posted on the Criteria Network. You'll find the link on the chat, and the study will be published in the next few weeks before year end. So keep an eye on the IDB website. And of course, I'd like to thank all participants once again and recognize the joint work done by the Banco de la República and AFID and the IDB that made this meeting possible. Have a great afternoon and look forward to seeing you again soon.